Typically, my story follows two very parallel lines. One storyline talks about my gradual rise to success in athletics. But then there's this other storyline that I talk about, and it's the fact that I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I've struggled with alcohol and drug addiction throughout my life. And then there's that ever-present soundtrack that I've had with, precarious mental health at different times in my life. And typically when I get off stage, people come up to me and they say they're inspired by what I say, and I always feel embarrassed and like I'm a big fraud when I hear those words. And they say, "You're so strong and you're so resilient." And so I kept hearing this word resilient over and over and over again, and I go home and I'm like, I'm not resilient, I'm crying all the time, I'm not resilient. And so 2 years ago I decided I'm gonna figure out what the hell this word means. So my plan was to interview people who I know and other people who I would reach out to who have incredible stories that I think are examples of resilience. So over the course of 2 years, I interviewed 130 people, 350 hours of interviews, and I interviewed people from all over the world. We covered every type of trauma, domestic abuse, sexual abuse. We covered addictions, food disorders, parents who had lost children tragically to accidents and to suicide. I interviewed former child soldiers, people who had seen their entire families wiped out to genocide, current and former sex workers, people dealing with incredible physical, mental, and emotional problems, and people towards the end of their life. Now, when I sat down with all these people, I had to structure an interview that would be the same interview for everybody. And going into it, I had two things that I was terrified of, and I wanted to make sure that I really stayed away from these two things. And the first was, I didn't want people to be re-traumatized. So although this stuff sounds heavy, the conversations were always light and inspiring. And the second thing was, most of the people who I'd spoken to had written books or were used to talking about themselves, so I had to get them off their script. So one of the things I did is I ended every interview with this question that I had been asked in an interview once, and the question completely blew my mind because I had no idea what to say. And the interview question was, what are you doing when you feel most beautiful? And it's a disarming question, and I'll let you let that sit into your head for a little while, and when you go home tonight, I'm sure you'll be thinking about this question. So, for instance, one of the people I interviewed was a man by the name of David France. Now, David France is a well-known author, and he's a filmmaker, and he's most known for a book that he's written that also became a Netflix documentary called How to Survive a Plague. And it's about the early years of the AIDS epidemic. Now, when I sat down with David and I interviewed him, and we got to this point of the interview, and I said, "So David, what were you doing when you felt most beautiful?" And he says, "JP, I have no problem answering this question. I was in a press conference with a lot of other advocates in Midtown Manhattan, and we were listening to the doctors and the researchers telling us that the drug cocktail was showing signs of success. And you have to realize that in that moment, we all looked at each other and we realized we have not been given a death sentence." And he said, "That was the moment I felt most beautiful." I spoke to a woman by the name of Elisa Parker. Now, Elisa Parker lived through something that most of us can't even imagine. She's one of the mothers who lost a child in the Sandy Hook school shooting in the US. And it was a really difficult time when I sat down with Elisa. We talked for about 2.5 hours. And we got to this question: what were you doing when you felt most beautiful? So Elisa said, 2 weeks after my daughter Emily was killed, I reached out to the family of the father of the shooter, Adam Lanza, the man whose son had killed my daughter. And the reason I reached out to him was that they had just conducted an autopsy on his son, the shooter, and they were planning on keeping the results quiet in the family. And I really wanted those results to be made public so that researchers could possibly learn from this. Is there something that we could do to avoid a future tragedy like this? So she said that was the purpose of this meeting. I was going to sit down with them. So this is 2 weeks after her daughter has been taken from her. And she said, I sat down with him, and within 5 minutes, sitting down across from him, I realized this man is another parent who has lost a child. Except he doesn't have any of the community support that I and the other parents have. And she said, in that moment, something in my heart broke open. And she said, I was filled with love and empathy. And she said, in that moment, that's when I felt the most beautiful. And then I interviewed a lady by the name of Judy Virago. Now, Judy Virago is an actress. And the thing about Judy, she has an incredible story. She was born in New Zealand, but she was born a man. And Judy spent most of her life, her teens and into her early 20s, living as a gay man. And eventually Judy transitioned to a woman. So when I asked Judy, hey Judy, what were you doing when you felt most beautiful? She said, oh, have I got a story for you? She said, it's definitely after I had a live performance. And I've done a really good job. And I'm sitting backstage, and there's all this confusion happening in the dressing room. And I'm sitting in front of my mirror. And I'm starting to take off my makeup. And there's mascara running down my face, and the lipstick is smeared all over. And she says, I look up in that mirror, and I just catch just a little glimpse of myself. And she says, JP, you have to realize, for all those years I was transitioning, I only felt beautiful when I had a wig on, and she said, when I had my face all made up. But here I am, taking off all of that. And it's in that moment I realize I'm beautiful because I've become the person I've meant to become. So here's the thing about beauty I've discovered. Beauty is not extraordinary. It's the opposite. Beauty is the ordinary. I set out to write this book on resilience, and I ended up writing a book about beauty. Now, beauty, to me, is found on the edges of our life. Beauty is found when we are in trauma, when we are in adversity, when we are in deep loss. The thing about beauty and resilience, it reminds us that this life, this sexy, dirty, messy, beautiful life, is worth living to the very last breath. So, what have I learned from all of this? Well, I would have to go back to answering this question myself. When did I feel most beautiful? 30 years ago, I was sitting in a palliative care unit with my father. I'd been watching him waste away for month after month. And we were sitting on the edge of the bed, and we weren't talking about the important things of life or the fact that how, advice for me, how I could be a better father to the unborn child that was growing in my wife's stomach, a child he didn't live long enough to see. No, we weren't talking about any of that stuff. What we were talking about was the Blue Jay game from the night before. Crazy. But I think my dad was trying to show me that it's going to be okay. Life will go on without him. So here I was sitting across from my dad. There was a cup of ice on the table between us. It was the only thing he could stomach at that time. But it was in that moment, that most terrifying yet safest place I've ever been in my life, that was the moment I felt most beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.